So let's dwell on NATO for a moment, shall we? The events underway today and tomorrow. Certainly the US Defence Secretary suggesting that NATO has grown stronger with the challenge of what we've seen. And is that, do you think, in a sense, a byproduct, a backfiring byproduct of President Putin's aggression, as NATO would see it here?
I do think it is. At least two of the strategic objectives of Russia are to divide and deter NATO and divide and weaken the EU. And what we've seen is largely a unified response from NATO. Of course, there'll be nuances in how you approach this, but you would expect that. And really, what are the three Ds of the moment of dialogue, deterrence, and diplomacy. And so they've all been successful at the moment. And that raises the cost to Putin of any action. I think it's also significant that the words of President Biden in terms of the likelihood of an attack at the moment is slightly gone down in intelligence terms. If you were to analyze his words, you'd say you'd put it now in the 55 to 75% probability of an attack. But like all these things, it's Russia who initiate and control the timetable, not the West if they're going to invade.
Well, let's pick up on one of your Ds then, shall we? Deterrence. Come on to sanctions in just a moment. But first of all, in terms of bolstering the eastern flank of NATO, already seeing more troops setting off, I think, from North Carolina. Do you think we might get promises from NATO that, you know, more bolstering will happen, possibly in the southeastern part?
Yeah, particularly in the southeast. So really in 2016, we changed the parameters after the Warsaw summit and went from a posture of reassurance to a posture of deterrence by denial. And that's what led to the enhanced battle groups in Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and Poland. Now, on the southern flank, the Supreme Allied Commander Europe has talked about additional battle groups in Romania and Bulgaria. So that really is deterrence by denial, which we've done there. Should Russia invade, you will go to a different posture, which is deterrence by punishment, and that includes sanctions.
What about this idea of de-escalation? Russia again saying that it's removing tanks, for example, overnight, some tank withdrawal. The Russian ambassador to Ireland, get it right, quoted by the TASS news agency, has suggested that the Russian forces in the West will be back to normal in 3 or 4 weeks. Now, the saying here, of course, is we wait to see if it really happens. But are you getting a sense that actually, when these exercises are over, that indeed might be the case?
No, I don't think so yet. But rather bizarrely, it was Stalin who said, trust people, but check. And that checking, the verification by surveillance, will tell you this. So really, it's the surveillance flights and the satellite imagery which will tell you if in force, space and time, the Russians still have a fight tonight capability there. And it's not really seeing a few tanks in Crimea sort of going from A to B. It's really seeing an off-ramp of combined arms army capabilities, long-range fires, or helicopters returning to the base further into Russian territory, which will give you an indication, because it's not battalion tactical groups, which will be significant if there's any war. It would be those combined arms army capabilities. And really, it would be for me to see capabilities withdrawing from Belarus rather than Ukraine, because from my perspective, I think the central gravity, the source of all the strength of the Ukrainians, is the resistance around Kiev. I don't think the Russians would achieve any strategic objectives just by going into the Donbass or the Crimea. They would actually reinforce the fact that Ukraine would still be westward looking after any invasion. And that's really the dilemma the Russians have, which really gives you a sense of whether they decide to invade. They need a trigger, they need local support, which today is the day of unity. It doesn't seem they have that. The anticipated military reaction, 45% of Ukrainians say that they'll fight against them. And can they actually have the technical feasibility at the moment? That is, that the weather's against them. So at the moment, there's a thing called rapetitsa, which is the mud of spring. And so you wouldn't want to be Putin's Met man at the moment if you were trying to decide on an invasion. Finally, Putin needs low economic and political costs. And can he secure all his strategic objectives at those low political and economic costs? I'm not sure he can at the moment.
Well, certainly from what we heard from Joe Biden, the cost will be absolutely enormous. The consequences for President Putin will be far-reaching and long-standing. So let's go on to sanctions then, whether they still have bite. Sanctions on Russia since they took Crimea in 2014, increased after the Salisbury poisonings and again after accusations of Russian interference in the US election. The problem is, of course, the price of oil. So are they somewhat shielded now by the impact of Western sanctions because of the very conflict that you might argue they have started?
Well, the first thing is that geoeconomic theories were in vogue about 30 years ago, but really people in power are not accountants, they're not bookkeepers. They look at whether they can achieve or increase their power. So that's the sort of setting within which we are at the moment. Now, the West and NATO have actually telegraphed a sort of batch of measures that they would take against them. The one I think that Russia would possibly fear is the cutting the financial Russian banks off from the international financial system, including the SWIFT. But the Russians will have wargamed this to see if they can deny that happening. The second, of course, that we would do is they would be embargoed from US technology. And the third one, which is the variable again, which we really talked about a bit earlier, is that we would arm the Ukrainians for the war after the war, assuming there is one. If Putin cannot have an early victory, you have a war after the war, which raises the political and economic costs to him. Finally, you've got this difficult one about Nord Stream 2. And I say it's difficult. There's been some fairly poor analysis on this. So there's actually a mutual dependency on the gas from oil. 73% of Russia's gas goes to the EU. They don't want to lose that income. Now we can sustain not having Russian gas for a number of months, and of course we also will have been gaming the fact that we might be able to have supply from somewhere else. But that's another key variable both for the West and the East. But an EU stress test in 2014 said that we could outlast, for a number of months anyway, any problems with gas being turned off from Russia. That doesn't mean that there's not a different issue about the cost of gas, but it's not the supply, which is in the short term an issue. And if we're in the issue of a long-term war, then we've got a different issue for Russia anyway. The first thing we would say is that armies don't fight wars, nations fight wars. And what Putin needs to achieve is the dislocation of both the armed forces of Ukraine, which I think he could do in the short term, the dislocation of the political entity of Ukraine, i.e. he needs to go to Kiev and put in a puppet regime. And thirdly, he needs to dislocate the Ukrainian people, those 45% who at least have said that they will sign up to any resistance against Putin. Now, what he's really done since April last year, when we had the first sort of war scare, is try and impose some psychological pressure on the Ukrainians. And actually, I think President Zelensky has been very good at making sure that alert fatigue has not been there in the Ukrainian people. But of course, Putin could sustain this pressure and have that psychological pressure on the Ukrainians. And it's that which often collapses societies in war, as we sort of saw in sort of the fall of France, for example, in 1940.
Just a quick word on Jair Bolsonaro, the Brazilian president, obviously meeting President Putin. This idea of the BRIC nations, Brazil, Russia, India and China, and a sense of the new world order, and whether, in a sense, President Putin is going back to old alliances in order to counter the West, and how you see geopolitically the impact of this long term.
Well, there's only been a West geopolitically 3 times in history: 1917, 1918, 1939 to 1945, and the Cold War. Now, the actions of Putin may actually reinforce the fact that there will be a political West in the future, because some of his actions already have made sure that NATO has been reinvigorated for the future. It may reinvigorate the EU. And so at the moment, it doesn't look like he's been that canny on achieving his strategic objectives. And as we were talking 4 years ago, really, Anna, Putin has a weak hand, which he's played well. But whether he's played it that well in 2022, as he sort of did over the Skripal case and all those things which led up to that with the American election, I'm not quite sure. I think he's kind of losing it. But that said, he will outlast all the Western politicians. We're currently in Putin 4.0. Putin is going to be in power unless something goes wrong until 2036. He has still got a long time there to achieve his political objectives. So don't write him off yet.
Well, you say that, and there we are, yet another day showing pictures of President Putin meeting a world leader. So in that sense, he's got entirely what he wanted, which is global recognition and a sense of power.
I'd actually reverse that and say that as many of those people have actually gone to see President Zelensky. So Zelensky has been also empowered by this. The Ukrainian people have been empowered by that. And I don't think that is a reaction that President Putin expected.